Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan features two radio professionals with over 100 years of broadcasting experience between them. Dave Hogan and Randy Houston are both native Western North Carolinians whose rich voices have been heard in every glade, cove, and holler of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, primarily on AM radio. And between the two of them, they've worked in just about every radio format. As you can imagine, these guys have tons of stories about the day-to-day of live radio and the interactions they've had with listeners and entertainers while they were immersed in, at the time, one of the most influential and informative mediums available. Those experiences will be featured in this podcast series. Check the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts with Randy and Dave on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. I'm the Houston part.
And a big Hogan howdy to you. Dave Hogan here, and we're here to dangle some participles and split some infinitives, okay? And we got an English expert over here in the corner, so we better...
So you showing off.
We better not dangle any participles.
you showing off that you know what a participle is.
Well, I heard one the other day. Correct me if I'm wrong.
A participle?
Yeah. Walking through the kitchen, the smoke alarm went off.
I hear you.
Yeah, the smoke alarm was walking through the kitchen. Well, you and I are going to talk a little bit today about the history of recording and how records were made back when they made records, what we called records. Some people probably, when you say record nowadays, wonder what it is. You know, the younger generation, kids coming on, like grandkids, you say something about a record, they'll say, what are you talking about?
That's right.
You believe it or not, when I started in broadcasting in 1957, we still played a few 78 RPM records. Now, the 78 RPM records were made of shellac.
Okay. Big old, thick, heavy things.
Yeah, and they would break easily. You had to be careful.
That's right,
because if you drop one on the floor, it would shatter. So you had to be very careful when you put a 78 RPM record on the turntable. And, of course, RPM stands for revolutions per minute. And I looked up the origin of the word shellac. Because I always wonder, you know, we use words and we never stop or seldom stop to think about where the word came from, what it means.
Mm-hmm.
There are some insects, the lac, L-A-C, lac insect, over in Thailand and India, in that part of the world. And the female, the she, secretes a resin that is harvested off the trees, combined with alcohol to make what we call shellac.
Shellac.
The she bug or insect, shellac.
So it took a lot of bugs to make a record.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then after the 78 RPM records, 45s were made out of vinyl being a synthetic product. You'd have to be a scientist to describe what vinyl is made of. And, of course, now we're into a whole different era of recorded music, and we'll get to that in a moment. But as I said, a few 78s, very few, but 78s were on their way out when I got into radio. The last 78 was manufactured in 1959. I got in radio in 1957 when 45s were becoming
commonplace.
45s and 33 and a third, 45 revolutions per minute, 33 and a third revolutions per minute, and your turntable had all three speeds.
Right.
And every disc jockey that worked in that era,
I know what you were going to say,
has been subject to that prank.
Of course.
Where you've gone to the bathroom, and while you've gone to the bathroom, somebody comes in.
You had a record queued up, ready to go.
You had a record ready to go.
On the right speed.
On the 45, and somebody would slip in and put it on 78. So you were sitting there. And now let's listen to Don Gibson and I Can't Stop Loving You.
I can't stop loving you.
I can't stop loving you. Every DJ has been the subject of that kind of.
Oh, and they're standing out in the hall looking through the glass, just laughing as you're stumbling and figuring it out, going, I apologize.
The first 45 RPM record, commercial record, was a country music record.
Really? I didn't know that.
1948, RCA Victor, Eddie Arnold, Texarkana Baby, the very first RPM, 45 RPM record. You remember the song?
Texarkana Baby, yeah.
She's my Texarkana baby. Do I love her, lordy law? Her pappy came from Texas, her ma from Arkansas.
Eddie Arnold.
Eddie Arnold's very first.
Yeah.
The very first 45 RPM record that was produced.
On RCA Records, and of course, it was the logo, the visual you get of that is the dog looking at the horn and staring down the horn.
The old
yeah.
gramophone, I guess.
Yeah.
I wasn't around with the gramophones and the cylinder records.
No, me either.
Believe it or not.
Well, we talked about that cutting records and where the word cutting came from. You said that when you came to WSKY in 1960, that one of those acetate cutting machines was in the house.
Yeah,
and
sure was.
And there was when I came along to 570 WWNC in 1975. There was one of them sitting over in the corner, unused, but it was a relic from days gone by.
And you'd only use an acetate one time.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
I didn't realize that.
Once you cut the groove.
Oh, that's right. Okay, gotcha.
That was it.
Yeah, no more. Yeah.
And I remember the program director at WSKY was Al Levy. And Al would do our PSAs, public service announcements, on those acetates. And so that's how we played. But most of our music, of course, was on 45s, but most of the commercials were on the reel-to-reel.
Yeah.
And if you had cut number 12...
down in that reel.
People say, what do you do while the record's playing? Well, in those days, if you had a commercial coming up for, let's say, Woolworth's department store, and on your program log, it would say cut 12, or first it would tell you what tape, and then what cut.
Hanging on the wall was some reel-to-reel tapes.
And you had to put your headphone jack into that tape recorder, run it down.
To cut 12.
To find cut 12.
While the record's playing. You're listening through your headphones.
Yeah, and it took a little time, to find cut 12, which was the commercial that you played next. So it was a little cumbersome, to say the least. But it was fun looking back on it. The first 78 RPM record, by the way, came out in 1898. And 78 RPM records were discontinued in 1959. The first 45 RPM record and the first 33 and a third came out in 1948. And as I said, the first single, 45, in any genre of music was Eddie Arnold and Texarkana Baby. So that's a little background of recorded music. But now, vinyl, there are still a lot of people who like vinyl. And there's a place in Asheville, the old Citizen Times building, where they record and they press vinyl records like we used to play, and also sell record players for people who would like to go back and play music off a record player like we used to. You and I had the pleasure of visiting that facility and watching them press a record. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the Citizen Times recording, or Citizen Times Vinyl Company, I think it's called, in the former Citizen Times building on O'Henry Avenue, downtown Asheville. And Dave and I had lunch in the lobby of the old building there, there's a nice deli, and we can see through the windows the pressing of those albums. It looked to me like they don't cut anymore. Cut an album. It's a heat press transfer situation, and they were pressing albums, and you can see that and have lunch there. Now, upstairs, I think it's the second floor, is where the studios of 570 WWNC were located from probably the 40s up to 1969.
Probably the late 30s.
Late 30s,
yeah,
okay.
Probably.
Yeah, you're right.
Bill Monroe, Jimmy Rogers,
right.
All the traditional country music artists from the 30s and 40s. You know, they had live radio back then.
It was called the Western North Carolina Farm and Home Hour. It was at 11 o'clock on every weekday morning, and it was live in the studios on the second floor of that building. And those studios at that time, my understanding were that they were state-of-the-art.
No question about it. You had to be state-of-the-art because, as I said, you had a lot of live programming. You had a piano in the studio.
Right. Orchestra, yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, the name is Citizen Vinyl.
Citizen Vinyl.
North Carolina's first vinyl record pressing company. And it's open to the public, and they give tours up there in the old Citizen Times building, where I'd say most people in the Asheville area know where it's located.
Yes, of course, and you and I are going to take that tour one of these days. I peered in from the hallway. I came to 570 in 1975. They had moved from that Citizen Times building out to what we called Radio Ranch. It was the 570 transmitter site, 65 acres of property out West Buncombe, Leicester Highway area. And they moved to that location with studios in 1969. So from 69 until this revival here by the Citizen Vinyl Company, it served as offices for the Asheville Citizen Times.
And they had, back before social media and the internet changed the radio industry, the TV industry, and the newspaper industry, the Citizen Times, I don't know how many employees they had, but it was a building full of employees.
Right.
I remember one time I was in the department, the what I'd call the want-ad department, classified ads. They had at least a dozen people just working in the classified ads department there at the Asheville Citizen Times.
Yeah, and it's really nice to see, and the folks that have developed the recording studio, they've put in some pristine analog and digital equipment up there that can master the recording and send it downstairs and have it pressed into a vinyl album. And there's the ear that it takes to hear the difference between the digital X's and O's, or ones and zeros that digital is, to hear the analog drum beat and bass guitar and vocals of analog and a real actual capture recording of the voice. It's gold.
There are people, Waylon Jennings was one of them. Waylon Jennings
didn't like digital.
Did not like digital at all. And he had the kind of ear that could really tell the difference. Now, we went from the 45 RPM record to compact disc.
And ones
CDs.
and zeros. Ones and zeros. That's what it is. That's what we put on the compact disc, was ones and zeros. Mm-hmm. Every note was transformed into a one or a zero.
I remember the first time that I played a CD instead of a record. I had been working for WJCW in Johnson City, and it was moving towards a talk format. And at that time in my career, I wanted to play music. I didn't want to do talk radio. Later on, I did. And I went to work for an FM station, US 99, there in the Tri-Cities in Johnson City. And they had just installed CD players. This was about 89 or 90. They had just installed CD players, just moved from turntables and 45s to CDs, and that's the first time that I played a CD. And it was goodbye to vinyl records. No more queuing up a record and getting ready to play.
It's I know. Now I'm in the digital world totally, 100%.
Tell us about your radio program in Hendersonville, Henderson County.
That is a classic country station with an incredible history, 1450 AM, FM 107.7, and it's WHKP.com where you can find the live stream. It's a classic country full-service radio station with a rich heritage since 1946, and I have the privilege of sitting in the air chair that some really great broadcasters have sat in. Kermit Edney was the owner of that property for many years, and I've shared with you some of his great broadcasting abilities, and now I do the morning thing there, 6 to 9 a.m., get to play classic country. And play, I underline and bold, play is all I do. I have fun on the air every morning from 6 to 9 playing the music that we played in the 70s and 80s and the classic country from the 60s. I played some Glazer Brother music this morning in reminding everybody about we had no water in Asheville, and the Glazer Brothers do such a beautiful version of that old song, Cool, Clear Water.
The Glazer Brothers, and I cannot understand why they are not in the Country Music Hall of Fame.
I totally agree.
I had a friend in Nashville. He went by the name Roy B. as a singer. His name was Roy Bledsoe. He knew a lot of the country music artists way back when. And so I got acquainted with Roy. He had a band and played on some of the country music shows I promoted in Asheville, opening act for some of the country music artists. And Roy took me out to the Glazer Brothers studio. They had a recording studio. And in that studio is where country outlaw music started.
Was born there,
Tom Paul Glazer was one of the outlaws. But they had one of the reasons. You remember it first started with realtors. And I believe, if I recall correctly, my son-in-law sold these frequencies, these low-frequency FM transmitters. You drive up to a house, and when you drove up to that house, you could tune to a certain frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And am I correct, Gina? You're not sure?
It's they're 2 to 3 watt FM transmitters, and on there's a tape loop in there that's going to tell you all about that house that's for sale you're sitting in the driveway of.
Maybe my daughter's husband, Mark Edwards, maybe he was just talking about doing that, but I remember a conversation with him.
It's done
but
a lot.
Anyway, here's what the Glazer Brothers did. They had this recording studio. And, of course, in a recording studio, you got the big speakers where you got the big booming sound.
Right.
And when you record something, you go a song or an artist, you go back and you listen to it to try to make sure that all the instruments are at the correct volume, etc. The Glazer Brothers installed one of those low power FM transmitters. They would go out to their car after they recorded somebody
to hear what,
and they would listen to what was recorded on the car radio because that's actually how the public was going to hear the music. Wasn't that genius?
Genius, and it's a trick that was used a whole lot and perfected for the sound of AM radio by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Mm-hmm. The mix was designed to hit in the frequency, the narrow frequency of the AM band. And if you hear Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons and Walk Like a Man or Sherry or something, it just jumped out of the radio at you. And you wanted to hear it again and again and again, and you wanted to go to buy it. And that's the way it worked.
But the Gladys Brothers knew that what they heard in the studio on those big speakers was not going to be the same
in the car,
on a car radio. And so they'd go listen on the car radio, and they'd say, well, the bass needs to be a little stronger, or that electric guitar is too loud. And they'd go back in and adjust it until they got it right. Genius. Why aren't the Glazer Brothers in the Country Music Hall of Fame?
And that harmony, I talked about it this morning on the show. Those three brothers were raised singing together. Those three brothers were raised singing together like the Gatlin brothers were and the Glazer brothers. And those three brothers together, that sound, you can't, digital world ain't no way. You can't replicate that.
And of course, Tom Paul became, as happens with a lot of groups, they split up for a while as a trio, and Chuck, I believe, ran the business part of the recording studio, and Jim had a particular role. I think he was more of the promotion person, and Tom Paul at one point went out on his own, and that's when he became a member of the Outlaws.
Yeah.
You know, there was Tom Paul and Willie and Waylon.
Willie and Waylon kind of got the headlines of that outlaw thing, but it really did start with the Glazer brothers.
That's where the Outlaw album was one of the first million-selling country music albums.
And Tom Paul was on that album.
And it was recorded at the Glazer Brothers studio.
Gotcha. Well, we talked about how we started, and we got the evolution of where we started was, I guess, would be vinyl and albums and tape, and how the taped world we had in radio transitioned over to digital, and we were introduced to compact discs, CDs, and that brought on the digital sound, and we went from the digital compact disc to literal now computer files.
Now you still play music on the radio.
Right.
Tell us what you play now and how you play it.
It's a computer file. It's, He Stopped Loving Her Today by George Jones is a computer file. And I sit there with a mouse and I see that song over here in my record bin. It's my big record shelf. We used to have record album shelves. Well, mine's on a screen now. And I go get He Stopped Loving Her Today, and I drag it over to my screen where I'm working on my show. And I think I'll do one more commercial, and I'll do the weather, and I'll do this promo for Hometown Hero, and then I'll play a jingle, and then I'll play He Stopped Loving Her Today.
And I remember you could stack your music and the commercials, and those DJs who smoked a cigarette go out and smoke a cigarette, and it'd automatically go from one to the other.
That computer.
Did you ever do that?
That computer.
Go out and smoke a cigar while...
Actually, we got to do that right now. We're about done with this, aren't we? We used to have so much fun together. Thank you all for joining us on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. We're getting a lot of, I won't say a lot of downloads, but we're getting a lot of people who are becoming more and more interested in what we have to say about our career in broadcasting, which is long and tarried.
Didn't make any money, but we had a lot of fun.
Got some great memories, don't we? Thank you, Dave. We'll be back next time, talk more about Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.